There's a certain kind of pride that doesn't need to be announced out loud because it's already woven into everything a person does. The way they sit, the way they speak, the way they react to even the smallest challenge. And when you spend time with All in the Family, especially when you start to look closely at Archie Bunker, you begin to notice how much of the show's tension, and honestly its emotional weight, comes from that very specific kind of pride, the kind tied to working-class identity, to the feeling of having earned your place in the world through effort, through routine, through endurance, and how easily that pride can turn into resentment when it feels like that effort isn't being respected anymore. And there's one kind of situation that really brings this into focus, one that shows up in different forms throughout the show, but always carries the same underlying current, where the conversation turns toward work, toward what it means, toward what it's worth, and it begins in that familiar living room where everything feels ordinary until it suddenly doesn't. Archie comes home, maybe a little more tired than usual, maybe a little quieter at first, and you can tell there's something sitting with him, something from the day that hasn't quite settled yet. And when the conversation starts, it doesn't jump straight into conflict. It eases into it, like most real conversations do. Maybe Mike brings up something about his own plans, something related to education, or a different kind of job, something that doesn't fit neatly into Archie's understanding of what work should look like. And at first, it might sound harmless, just two people talking about their lives. But then Archie reacts, and that's where the shift happens. Because for Archie, work isn't just a way to earn money, it's a measure of worth, a definition of identity, something that tells him and everyone else exactly where he stands. And when that definition is challenged, even indirectly, it doesn't feel like a discussion. It feels like something personal. He responds with that familiar certainty, that grounded confidence that comes from years of doing things a certain way, from believing that effort, physical effort, consistent effort, is the foundation of respect. And when Mike pushes back, when he suggests that there are other ways to contribute, other ways to define value, it doesn't just sound like a different opinion. It sounds like a dismissal, like everything Archie has built his identity around is being questioned. Gloria feels it too, because she understands her father's pride. She's seen it her whole life. But she also shares Mike's perspective in many ways. And that tension between those viewpoints shows up in her reactions, in the way she tries to navigate the conversation without letting it spiral too far. And then there's who listens with that same quiet attentiveness, who sees the emotional weight of what's being said even when the words themselves are sharp. And when she speaks, it's not to take sides, it's to remind everyone that there's more to this than just being right. What makes this kind of scene so powerful is that the resentment Archie feels isn't presented as something random or exaggerated. It's rooted in something real, something tied to a broader social context, to the experience of working-class Americans in the 1970s, a time when economic shifts, cultural changes, and new ideas about success were starting to reshape the landscape. For someone like Archie, who has spent his life believing in a certain path, a certain structure, those changes don't just represent progress, they represent uncertainty, They raise questions about whether the rules he followed still matter, whether the effort he put in is still valued the same way. And that's where the resentment comes from, not just from disagreement, but from a sense of being left behind, of being told, even indirectly, that the way you've lived your life might not be enough anymore. The living room setting makes all of this feel even more immediate, because there's no distance, no buffer, the conversation happens right there, in a space that feels personal, familiar, and that familiarity makes the tension feel closer, more real. As the discussion unfolds, it doesn't move in a straight line. It loops, it builds, it circles back. And that's because it's not driven by a need to resolve anything. It's driven by the characters, by their perspectives, by their emotions. Archie might repeat himself, not because he has nothing new to say, but because his belief is so deeply rooted that it keeps coming back in the same form, the same language. Mike might try different angles, different arguments, but his frustration starts to show, because he realizes that this isn't just about logic, it's about identity. Gloria's reactions add another layer, more emotional, more immediate, and presence creates those small, quiet pauses where the intensity softens just enough to keep the conversation from breaking completely. And the humor in all of this comes from that interplay, from the way these personalities collide, from the way the conversation escalates and then settles and then rises again. You might laugh at Archie's insistence, at the way he frames his arguments, at how firmly he holds onto his perspective, and at the same time, you might feel the discomfort underneath it, the recognition that what he's expressing isn't entirely unfamiliar. And that's part of what made All in the Family so groundbreaking, because it didn't shy away from these kinds of complexities. It didn't present working-class identity as something simple or one-dimensional. It showed how pride and resentment could exist side by side, how they could shape the way a person sees the world. At a time when television often leaned toward cleaner, more resolved storytelling, this show allowed its characters to remain complicated, to hold onto their beliefs even when they were challenged, to exist in that space between understanding and resistance. As the scene reaches its peak, there's often a moment where everything feels like it might break, where the tension is at its highest. And then something shifts, not dramatically, not with a clear resolution, but with a small change in tone. Maybe says something gentle, something that brings a bit of warmth back into the room. Maybe Gloria steps back, maybe Mike pauses, and the intensity eases just enough for everyone to breathe. But the underlying feelings don't disappear, the pride is still there. The resentment is still there, just beneath the surface, ready to emerge again in another conversation. Watching it now, you can still feel how relevant it is, because questions about work, about value, about what it means to contribute, are still very much part of everyday life. The specifics may have changed, the context may be different, but the emotional core, the desire to feel respected, the fear of being overlooked, that remains. And that's why the show continues to resonate, because it doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't try to resolve those tensions in a neat way. It lets them exist. It lets them be part of the ongoing dynamic. As the living room settles back into its usual rhythm, as the characters return to their routines, there's a sense that the conversation isn't over, that it's just paused, waiting to continue. And maybe that's the most honest thing the show does. It shows that these kinds of feelings don't just disappear, they evolve, they resurface. They shape the way people interact over time. So when you sit with that, when you think about how much of the show's power comes from that combination of pride and resentment, it becomes clear that what you're watching isn't just a sitcom. It's a reflection of something deeper, something ongoing. And that's the kind of storytelling that stays with you, not because it gives you answers, but because it shows you something real, something recognizable, something that continues to matter.